The cathedral sat like a stone animal in the dark, ribs of vault and stained glass eyes watching the island go quiet. The Seine breathed cold against the embankment. I checked my watch, 7:45 p.m. The second hand stuttered, the way cheap watches do. The south gate was a slab of iron in a Romanesque arch, paint worn thin by a century of hands. A rook clacked its beak somewhere in the tower, and then went still. Helen Martin met me at the small door off the transept, her shoes saying nothing on the stone. "Adrian Mercer," I said. "Night security." "Helen Martin." "Night manager." She didn't offer her hand. She turned, and the smell of cold wool lifted off her coat as we stepped into the cloistered quiet. The office was a pocket in the wall, an oak desk polished by wrists long dead, a modern monitor with a soft hum, a paper logbook, cover furrowed like old leather. A small brass bell hung from a bracket, clapper dark with thumbprints. The air held warm dust, paper, and the thin bitter of machine ozone. She set a ring of keys on the desk. They were heavy, iron, each tooth filed with a tiny Latin letter, A for archives, S for Southgate, U for Undercroft. The ring answered itself with a metallic cry, far too loud for the room. "These are the rules," she said, sliding a sheet toward me. The paper was crisp, the letters bold. 1. Don't open the south gate after the midnight bell. 2. If a cleric isn't in the registry, avoid him. 3. Don't go down to the Undercroft, no matter the prayers you hear. 4. Trust the bells, not the clocks. 5. If the stained glass shows the wrong colors, leave at once. I laughed before I could stop myself. A little theatrical. "This is not a joke," she said, voice flat. "Just follow the rules. They're there for your protection." Her eyes were steady. Not fear, knowledge. She walked me through the rounds. Reading room with its ladder on rails, scriptorium tables, triforium walkway above the nave where wind lives even when the windows stay shut. She tapped the bell pull with 2 fingers. Mechanical. If power fails, this never does. The rope smelled faintly of hemp and rain. By 8 p.m. the last carts rolled away. Emily Laurent waved as she passed, hair tucked behind one ear, smell of soap and paper trailing her. "Night shift, huh? Brave. Pays better than the mall." She laughed and left. The big door breathed out a final draft and sealed. Half the lights dropped by policy to protect the manuscripts. The cathedral inhaled a silence, the kind that holds a note you can't hear yet. Sounds grew: teeth, the click of my boot heel, a quiver in the old glass of the scarystory, wind stroking the gargoyles outside. The radiator ticked a cooling sequence. I forced myself to do the boring things. Hygrometer, 52%. Thermometer, 18 degrees Celsius. I opened the shade 1 notch and noted how moonlight striped a Latin title. At 9, I signed the first checkpoint. Ink dragged like honey. The brass bell breathed a little, metal settling. Somewhere deep in the stone, the building adjusted, and in that settling, something that was not the building took a step. The keys on the ring bumped each other as if they had heard it and had opinions. The first odd thing seemed minor. A single monitor woke itself, pale blue on a sleeping face of plastic. My reflection slid over it as I passed, a dark oval on an artificial sky. Then came a tapping. Not a leak, not a mouse. Keystrokes, steady, clean, like someone who learned to type when keys were steel. I turned my head without turning my shoulders. He was there, seated at the catalog terminal. Old suit, back straight, wrists hovering at the correct height. The screen lit his cheekbone a corpse blue. His hair had the tidy shine of a photograph. The keys clicked in a pattern that nearly matched the beat in my throat. I didn't speak. I didn't clear my throat. Rule 2 slammed down like a bar across a door. If a cleric isn't in the registry, avoid him. I finished the rest of the room as trained. Shelves, tabletops, window latches, case locks. My flashlight halo slid past him, and with effort, slid past again. The air near him felt like water from a deep well, cold that makes your teeth think of metal. I left. Back at the desk, I flipped through cameras. Every chair in the reading room was empty. The terminal showed only a dark rectangle. No man, no wrists, just the faint dither of a screen. I rubbed my eyes until sparks danced. When I lowered my hands, the tapping had changed tempo. It was almost my name. Adrienne. Adrienne. The small bell on the wall ticked as if cooling. The logbook rasped under my palm. A curl of dust lifted and hung like breath in winter. I wrote what I'd seen, and didn't write what I knew. The knave exhaled. Far above, a rook shuffled claws. Somewhere, a door that nobody had used in years remembered how to think about opening. The keys on the ring answered each other again in small bright notes, like a warning, said politely. The first laugh came thin as a reed note, and far too early. Children aren't in the cathedral after 9. And yet the giggle threaded out of the small reading nook, mini chairs, a low table with rounded corners, a basket of cloth puppets that always smelled faintly of library glue. I stood at the edge of the nave and let the sound pass through me like a draft. Rule 2 leaned on my shoulder. If a cleric isn't in the registry, avoid him. This was not a cleric. But the impulse was the same. Do not acknowledge. The stained glass over the south aisle should cast rubies, cobalt, and a smear of gold onto the flagstones. Tonight, the color went wrong. Purple-black bloomed where red should live, like bruised fruit. I lifted the conservation shade an inch, then lowered it again, because the shade did nothing to correct the spectrum. The wrong color crawled inside my eyes and stayed. A rook shuffled claws outside and knocked once against the lead. Wind smelled of river and wet stone. The old iron housings ticked as they cooled. A scratching began at the south gate, small at first, like grit moved by a fingertip. The iron frame tremored so slightly my knees felt it more than my ears. Then the half-hour bell rolled, and with each note the rivets answered with a delicate complaint, a metal hum you'd mistake for a building settling. If you hadn't seen mechanics with wrenches go pale at it last week. I wrote in the log, scratching, intermittent, frame vibrates with bell, no visible source. The nib left a burr of paper there that clung to my hand when I lifted it. Procedure filled the time. Walk the triforium, flagstones cold through the soles, draft lifting the hair at the back of my neck. Check the scriptorium tables, blotters aligned, lampshades half-mast, leather labels facing outward. The catalog keyboard waited with a hunger I could feel in my teeth. I let my light slide past it, onto the floor, and away again. The tapping had stopped, but the silence leaned close as if to smell my breath. At 2 a.m., the scratching sharpened to the sound of nail against paint. I stood 10 feet off the south gate and did not move closer. Rule 3. Don't go down to the undercroft, no matter the prayers you hear. It was written for stairs, not doors. But the undercroft breathes up through that threshold. The bell rope in the corridor hung like a promise I wasn't ready to touch. I walked away. Around 4:30 a.m., the wrong color drained out of the glass, the way fever drains out of a face. The wrongness left a taste in my mouth, old penny, old blood. The reading lamps hummed with a decency that felt almost human. My breath didn't show when I exhaled. Radiators kept up. I told myself I'd been good. Procedural, unreactive. A man wearing rules the way one wears a harness. But 5 a.m. made me a liar. I rounded the 19th century's stacks, leather backs, gold numbers, the sweet powder of foxed paper, and she stood in the aisle, 8, maybe 9. Dark hair and tidy braids, a white dress catching the reddening pre-dawn, her hands clasped just below her ribs, the way careful children do in serious places. "Can you help me find a book?" she asked. The voice belonged in any storytime afternoon. It did not belong here. My mouth opened, because I was still the kind of man who answers a child without thinking. Rule 5 reached up and closed my jaw. If the stained glass shows the wrong colors, leave at once. The colors had returned to correct. The rule wasn't in play, but the larger law, the one the building keeps under everything, said, don't engage the wrong thing with the right words. I took a breath. Let it out without sound. I did not nod, I did not shake my head. I backed away at a speed a camera would call calm. "Please," she said, stepping once. The smile went past human geometry. Too many teeth in a mouth that had learned the idea of smiling, without the proportions. My stomach tightened the way it does when a step is missing on a staircase you have taken all your life. I dropped my light to the floor and walked it like a tightrope back to the desk. The monitors showed empty aisles, empty chairs, empty doorways. In the aisle where I had seen her, the air was miserly and still. I looked at my hands. The skin across my knuckles whitened from gripping the flashlight too tight. The brass bell on the wall ticked in its sleep. At 6 a.m., the small door in the transept sighed. Day returned on Helen's coat in damp wool and bakery smell. She read my face the way a nurse reads a monitor. "How was your first night?" she asked. "Fine," I said. "Quiet." "You followed the rules?" she asked. Every single one had been touched, as if an invisible hand had walked the list with me. Monitors, cleric, undercroft, wrong glass, a child's simple ask. I nodded. Her eyes didn't move, but her mouth said the thing I didn't want to hear. The building had only been polite so far. The rook on the tower clacked its beak once. The sound felt like a small clock being wound. I signed the log in a neat hand, and her eyes told me the next night would not sign so easy. A week of nights makes a man two people, the one who writes and the one who watches the one who writes. I kept a secondary journal in a cheap black notebook, soft cover, oily from my thumb. Times, smells, temperatures, which chair creaked when I wasn't looking, where the wrong color gathered on glass before sliding away, when the bell rope seemed to breathe. On the 7th day, I stopped pretending it was only drafts and humidity. I opened the security archive at the desk, scrolled back. Files named with dates and camera codes. 3 months ago, a different man walked these aisles with the same posture I wore when I wasn't thinking. Michael Arden. The badge showed his name for a second at a corner angle, then posture again. Professional hurry. The habit of glancing at corners without letting your head betray you. The reading room camera showed him stop exactly where I had stopped. The catalog terminal glowed dull blue. A man sat there. Back straight, old suit, built like bridges. Michael did the thing I had not done. He approached. His mouth moved. No audio, but you can read the rhythm of a greeting anywhere. He lifted his hand, set it on the typist's shoulder. The lights blinked on the footage. 1 frame. 2. When the feed steadied, Michael's hand hung in the air over an empty chair. He looked at his palm as if it had betrayed him, then spun toward the aisle, toward the stair. The hallway camera caught him walking fast. He touched his watch, climbed 2 steps, turned his head, as if someone had spoken the other half of his name. He went back down. He never appeared on any other camera in the building again. I sat very still. The fan in the monitor made a sound like breath through a reed. My skin felt an inch too small for my bones. I backed the footage up, watched twice more. The same blink, the same vanishing. A man taken as neatly as a word cut from a prayer. Coffee with Emily the next morning. Round tables, steam hiss, the smell of butter in everything. The city was too awake for what I wanted to say. So I asked questions like a man who only likes history. When did this place become a library? I asked. She didn't even need her phone. Late 1800s for the first formal collections, she said. But the space was used for reading for centuries. Before that, she stirred, made a face. They say it was the place you didn't want to be taken at dawn. Executions. It's a city. We layer the new on the old and pretend the old forgets. Has anyone, I tried to sound casual, ever gone missing here? A couple of heart attacks, she said. A volunteer who left mid-shift and just didn't come back. In the 90s. Rumor. She smiled to make it smaller, then tilted her head. Helen looks exactly the same in photos from the 50s. It's uncanny. She laughed like it was a good joke to tell in daylight. That night, the aisle lights made obedient pools as usual. Air at 18 degrees Celsius. Dry enough, the hygrometer read like a praise report. At 9:48 p.m., one terminal lit on its own. I didn't cross the threshold. I wrote the anomaly in both logs. At 10:20, the stained glass pushed purple again, then quit. At 11:17 p.m., the city blinked off. It went with an authority that removed sound. Exit signs kept their small, red honesty. Everything else failed. I held my breath because the room had stopped using its own. The radio gave me only texture. Static like rain you could put your hand through and come away wet. The bell rope hung without opinion. The south gate made the sound locks make when they decide they belong to someone else. A bolt turned. A hinge changed its mind. Cold rose off the threshold like cellar air, and took the hair on my forearms in its teeth. In that silence, a child's whisper found my full name. It used it with a tenderness that felt obscene. Adrian Mercer. My teeth clicked once. The sound belonged to someone else's mouth. I wrote 11:17 p.m. blackout in the log. The pen dug a puncture into the page. I found the breaker by the fact of my breath making white. The keys on my belt whispered to each other in small bright notes. A little like prayer. A little like warning. The utility panel lives in a narrow room, smells like varnish, coil dust, and a memory of rain. My flashlight made a tilting cone, cobweb rope, a set of switches like teeth. 3 breakers were down. I lifted them one by one and felt the building take electricity back into itself. First a hum from near the sacristy. Then a blink as emergency lighting conceded to steady dim. Then the throb of the server waking in the office. I waited with my palm against the cool metal for a count of 30. The brass bell in the hall gave a dry tick. In the reading room, a lamp shade settled into its shadow like water pouring level. The city outside coughed on again in pieces. One window, then a cross street, then a tram display limping back to Numerit. I told myself we had simply lived through infrastructure, doing what infrastructure does. When I came back into the nave, a brown handprint shone on the scriptorium table. 5 splayed fingers. Heel of the palm right at the edge, as if someone had decided not to climb up. The color was old blood or varnish. I could smell iron, a little shellac. I reached for a cloth, and by the time my hand found one, the print was gone. The cloth smelled only of lemon oil, and the work we actually do. The cameras were obediently boring. Chairs, case locks. The south gate closed in a way that wouldn't make a mechanic swear. The catalog terminal weighted blue. The keyboard did not depress itself. I wrote, transient stain on table, no surface change, and sat with my back to the wall. Because that felt like the thing a man should do when his instincts go feral. Morning put its pale shoulder against the windows, shoved a little light inside. At coffee, Emily talked deaths like footnotes, an old patron here, a volunteer there. The accumulation made my chest tight. It's an old city, she said, smiling because daylight wants that. Old cities keep their stories. She lifted her cup to staying awake. Do you have a photo archive? I asked. Staff pictures? In the records room, she said, and the way her eyes flicked toward Helen's office told me even daylight has edges. At 2 a.m. that night, I signed the last line in the log. The pen snagged a little. A breath colder than January touched the back of my neck. It wasn't a draft. Drafts are dumb. This had intention. A wetness that made me think of mouths. I set the pen down, did not turn. Every bit of training I had said, waste no attention, you don't need to waste. The cold slid over my right shoulder blade, slow, bureaucratic, then left. My skin went to goose flesh in a wave, and the wave stayed even after the cold was gone. I slept 2 hours after shift, then tried to shave. My hand hesitated when the mirror gave me someone else's temples. A fine silver had threaded itself at the hairline. 2 small highways driven through the black. The hair didn't look dyed, it looked old, like museum cloth you're not allowed to touch. My stomach did a small, private thing. You broke a rule. Helen stood in the doorway. Her face in the mirror made me think of portraits that watch you no matter where you stand. I turned. She was the same in real space. Tired, precise. The streaks at her own temples bright in morning light. She lifted a finger toward my hair, then dropped her hand before she touched me. The third rule is perhaps the most important, she said. Her thumb rested against the beads of her rosary. She did not scold, she named, and the naming did something inside my ribs. I thought of the hinge turning, the breath that knew my name, my own voice saying, "Stand back," to a door that should never be negotiated with. The ink in the log from last night looked thicker where I'd written it. The office clock ticked like each second had grit in it. The silver in my hair caught the lamp, winked like a small, unwelcome star. I dried my face with a towel that smelled of chems and the mundane safety of laundry. I chose not to look at the mirror again on my way out. I took the notebook with me to the Société d'Histoire de Paris, because fear makes you courteous to facts. The reading room smelled of paper that has made peace with its age. Lignin sweet like biscuits left too long in the oven. The archivist wore half-moon glasses, a tie that looked inherited. He listened to my request like a man taking a pulse. Library incidents, disappearances, staff records. He returned with boxes that asked me to be patient with twine knots. Inside, clippings browned to toffee, a typed police report that still smelled faintly of ink ribbon, a hand-drawn floor plan with the undercroft hashed like a wound someone had wrapped. A list written in a hand so careful it made mine look sloppy. 1903, 1911, 1932, 1958, 1966, 1974, 1982, 1989, 1991, 1998. Names beside years. A column that simply said, "Missing." William Caron had a double underline. Note, night guard. Last logged at Southgate. Journals? I asked, forcing my voice to sound like a man who collects things, not a man being collected. Personal accounts? He tapped the police report. There was mention of a guard's journal in 1932, he said. Property of the cathedral, not ours. He slid a folder toward me. A photocopy of a clipping. 1930s politeness that knows how to smother. Staff member found unconscious after hours. No details provided. The photo had a face that looked entirely like Helen's, and had no business doing so. Night gave me an hour alone before the building remembered I belonged to it. I walked the lexicon shelves, heavy dictionaries with spines like ship keels. Behind Lex S. Late, a draft licked my cheek. Books do not draft unless there is a seam. I pressed the end cap, wood warm from the day, and felt it give a fraction. A panel where a panel should not be. I found the right key by sound, the one that made the ring answer in a register that felt honest. The door swung on hinges that had learned not to squeal 100 years ago. Inside, metal filing cabinets in a row, dust combed thin where someone had passed more recently than anyone admits. Labels written by a clerk with good penmanship and too much to do. Personnel, historical, a leather-bound book. J. Miller stamped without vanity on the cover. I opened it. The smell of old ink lifted like a ghost with good posture. Jacob Miller wrote temperatures and boiler pressures in a steady hand. 3 weeks in, the handwriting hiccuped. Saw a man by the catalog tonight. Did not respond when called. Mr. Williams says it happens. Days later, voices from below. Like children, but no children at night. Mr. Williams says never open after dark. For my safety. Then, a sentence that changed everything. He asked my name. When I told him, he smiled. Teeth wrong. The last entry? They know me now. Mr. Williams says I have broken the rules. Don't linger there, a voice said behind me. I almost dropped the book. David Rook stood in the seam of the door, mop in hand, face that had learned to live next to the wrongness without letting it in. That room keeps stories that add themselves, he said softly. You don't want to hear your own voice when you haven't spoken. You know, I said, keeping my voice flat. He nodded. Eyes went to the children's corner. as if the shelves could hear him. "Avoid story time," he said. "Names have power. Don't give yours. Don't take theirs. Don't let them take yours." He run the mop. Water smelled like ammonia and the safety of mundane chemicals. "You've seen the typist, I take it. And the child," I said. He winced. "She's the worst of them." He made the sign of the cross, not on his body, but in the air exactly halfway between us. "She asks for help with a book. What she wants is a person." "Hello, Adrian," the penitent child said, right behind my left ear. The sound was soft enough to make my teeth ache. I turned slower than a man turns in a dream, and still too fast. She stood close enough that the fine baby hairs at her hairline stirred in my breath. The white dress held the sconces yellow, and gave none of it back. Her smile showed all of a mouth's working parts, and a few I didn't have names for yet. The mop water trembled. A droplet climbed the wooden handle against gravity until it decided physics had earned a reprieve. I closed my hand around the key ring, edges pressed crescents into my palm. The metal sang in tiny notes that matched my heartbeat. Fast, tinny, alive. The south gate began like a patient trying a doorknob in a hospital at night, slow and polite. A lick of cold air tested the seam and found it. The iron breathed. I stood in the aisle and considered the distance between Rule 1, don't open the south gate after the midnight bell, and the fact of the bolt easing itself backward. The midnight bell rolled through the city. The sound pressed the stone the way a hand presses linen flat. The gate answered with a sound like a man swallowing a word. "It's William Karen, please," came up from below. Voice adult. Voice ruined. "Please." I should have walked away. I should have let the bell play the end of that sentence. Instead, my boots went forward 3 steps, like they belonged to a man who still thought rescue was a universal solvent. "Stand back," I said, because I still thought distance could be negotiated with grammar. And in saying it, I laid my attention on the thing calling my name. Rule 2 cracked. I heard the crack the way you hear a knuckle go where it shouldn't. The key for the south gate is long, heavy, older than any of us. It fed itself into the lock with an intimacy that made my stomach revolt. I turned it 1 notch. The gate let itself change minds the width of my thumb. Dark met me like tar. The cold had teeth. White fingers slid into the space, like something that had practiced on tighter gaps, long, thin, joints doubled back, nails black and crescent curved, like iron filings had had time to dream. The smell that came with them was copper and rot, the way water in old pipes tastes when a building hasn't been used in a while. A sound came out of the dark, not belonging to any animal. It belonged to an instrument a hand shouldn't play. I slammed the door, because even a fool sometimes listens to the right part of himself. The fingers caught, the gate bit down. Black fluid squeezed around bone like ink being taught a new verb. The iron sang a bad note. The sound that answered made my spine imagine antlers growing and then snapping off. I turned the key. The lock weighed my sin and decided I could have the door back. I backed away because my body took the wheel for a minute. The fluid puddled. It ran toward me with the intention of water. Except water doesn't smell like pennies in a mouth that used to be yours. I chose the stairs, because stairs mean height, and height means choices. Halfway up the spiral, the cataloger stood in the landing like a thought that won't stop. For once, he faced me. His eyes reflected nothing, a green-yellow flatness. The color glass has before life teaches it how to show things. He took a step where my step should go next. If I looked, I acknowledged. If I acknowledged, I opened a gate inside my head. I closed my eyes, the way a man shuts the book that has a curse on the last page. I walked forward into his cold. It was the cold of a river in spring, when the ice has just gone, but leaves its argument behind. Voices traveled through the cold, 50 of them, none of them with words I could keep. All of them saying the same thing I couldn't stand to know. When I cleared the landing, the air thinned back to stone-flavored. I opened my eyes. The hallway behind me was empty. I signed the last checkpoint at 4:58, with a hand that wasn't writing in straight lines. At the sink, I splashed water on my face. The water smelled decently of chlorine and city. The mirror put a stranger in front of me. 2 pale streaks just visible at the temples. Hair a decade older than the rest of me. I reached up. The silver felt like any hair feels. Helen's reflection arrived in the mirror, right after the streaks. "The third rule is perhaps the most important," she said. She didn't ask what I had done. She had done it once. The rosary in her pocket made a small pearl sound when it shifted. I dried my face on a paper towel that rasped. The paper bunched in my hands. The building breathed in, as if it had a plan for the breath it would take next. I couldn't sleep. I sat at the oak desk after shift, with the lamp still dim, and the city busying itself outside. The smell of spent incense clung to the stone, a memory that might have been mine or the building's. The desk had a seam under the lip where thumbs had worried it for decades. I pushed, and the wood pressed back. I pressed again, and a small wooden panel withdrew, with the embarrassed cough of a secret that knows it is about to be told. Inside, a leather notebook the color of dried blood, and a metal box the size of a missile. The notebook's cover had no name, only the idea of a name, worn away by other hands. The first page opened on April 20th, 1932. Compact, decisive script, found an empty journal in Jacob Miller's desk after they declared him missing. Something happened to him. I aimed to find out without sharing his fate. Initials only, HS. HS made no poetry. He made lists that felt like knots. The typist is the reference made flesh. He changes with the tools. The children's corner houses imagination's shadow. It rearranges when neglected. The undercroft is fear. It speaks in voices you would be ashamed not to follow. Then a sentence that underlined itself inside my head. They cannot harm what you do not acknowledge. Attention is the gate. Hunger passes through what you give it. The metal box woke a smell of machine oil and paper stored too near an old stove. Inside lay photographs. Staff on stone steps, October light making everyone squint. In the back row of each, Helen, not younger, not older, simply there, the posture, the mouth, the mathematical calm. I turned one over, pencil, staff after restoration. Another bore a clipped headline, local librarian hospitalized after late-night incident, 1952. No details. Decency used to mean silence. A draft came along the floor, touched my ankles, and thought better of me. I tucked the photos back, because hands know when to quit, even when the brain still wants to keep counting. As I slid the lids shut, the small brass bell on the wall shivered once. No full ring, just the soft thrum bells make when the air moves their skin the exact wrong way. Half a minute later, the big bells in the tower misbehaved. One heavy note landed early by my cheap watch. Rule 4 said, trust the bells, not the clocks. But the bells had chosen to speak before time asked. I did not like what that implied, about who did the asking. I reached back into the desk cavity, in the dark corner where the carpenter had signed his work. A cut, 2 lines crossing and a curl. A mason's mark I couldn't name. Where my finger touched it, the wood held a thin glow. Not blue exactly, but blue adjacent, in the way a bruise argues with light. Lines like that had to go somewhere. My finger hovered over the wood, a second longer than my common sense wanted. I closed the compartment. From the nave, the long stone gave a subtle pop, the way old houses do when they remember heat. On the far side of the children's corner, a chair that had been aligned to the table notched itself 1 degree away as if a small body had just left it. The smell of crayons, impossible at this hour, lifted and vanished, replaced by lemon oil and the sober sweat of volunteers who have done honest work. Dawn cooled the glass by increments. The city tested its voice with a siren 2 bridges away. On my way out, I slipped a single photo into my pocket. 1954. Staff on steps. Helen's face in the back row. Because proof feels like safety, even when it isn't. The edge bit my thigh through the fabric each time I moved, a paper tooth, keeping me awake. I waited for Helen, with the photograph a worry in my hand and the early bell's rawness still crawling around the inside of my ears. I would ask, "How long have you really worked here?" and watch which part of her face moved. The mason's mark under the desk seemed to hum in my skin, exactly where my finger had pressed it, and somewhere behind the south gate. Something patient tapped once, to be sure I hadn't forgotten it was there. Helen's office belonged to 3 eras at once. A rotary phone sat beside a modern monitor. Wires twined like vines no one had the heart to cut. The desk was old oak, edges shiny where wrists had polished them for decades. A small lamp with a parchment shade sent yellow into the corners. The room smelled of wax and the clove note of furniture polish. On a coat tree hung a plain black cardigan. No personal photos. The only decoration, a framed ticket stub for a fundraising concert that no one remembered. She took the photograph from me and set it flat. Her fingers smoothed the curl, the way you smooth a page that wants to resist. In 1952, she said without preface, I broke a rule. Her thumb touched her rosary where it pooled on the desk. A young woman asked for help with local history after closing. I knew better. I told myself it would be quick. What did they take? My voice surprised me by how steady it sounded. My future, she said it without melodrama. I don't grow old in the ordinary way. I don't move along the line with the rest of you. I remain as I was that night. She lifted a strand of her hair, pale at the temples the way mine had gone, and let it drop. The streaks appeared immediately, a mark like yours. The lamp's shade warmed the bones in her face. Outside in the nave, a late tourist's footsteps moved like uncertain punctuation, and then stopped when the guard at the door invited them out. Helen's eyes drifted to the window, where a triangle of stained glass threw red onto a filing cabinet. The rules protect you from them, she said, but they also protect them from you. Or rather, they protect what's outside these walls from what lives here. Every time a rule is broken and someone is taken, the entities step a little further away from what they began as. They get hungry, in a way that isn't local. Beyond these walls, I said. You mean into the city? She nodded once. When this library was young, the rules weren't needed. The building contained itself. The more fear we fed into it, the more shape that fear learned to wear. If the balance fails, the hunger spreads. The rules protect everyone, Adrian, not only you. The word everyone went through me like cold. I thought of the river coughing mist. I thought of the bells rolling a beat early. I thought of Emily, laughing too easily about photographs where Helen never aged. How many people know? Very few. Those who stay either mark or serve. She didn't smile. I serve. We sat with the small lamp hum and the soft tick of the wall clock. The clock said 10 to 5. The bell above would announce the hour when it chose. When she finally stood, the chair's legs made a tired sound. I can't undo what happened to me, she said, but I can prevent worse. That is why I am still here. When I left the office, the nave held a strange tension, as if the stone had an opinion and was waiting to voice it. In the afternoon, as the winter light leaned off the river, the island flickered. A split-second twitch of the street lamps, a blip in the tram display, the kind of thing commuters swear they imagined. The monitors in the reading room hiccuped and righted. The brass bell on my wall made a tiny, unhappy noise. Emily stopped at the door on her way out. She looked like she'd rehearsed a question, and then set it back down. Take care tonight, okay? She said instead. She glanced at my hair and pretended not to. Stormfront coming in. They said the power might be spotty. Trust the bells, not the clocks, I said before I could stop myself. She blinked. What? Nothing, I said. Sleep well. After closing, the cathedral had that carried emptiness it gets before a concert. Space tuned. Breath held. The air smelling of stone and old incense, and a little wet wool from the doormat. I checked humidity, temperature, seals. I wrote 52%, 18 degrees Celsius in the log with a hand I had to unclench around the pen. Night fell like a decision. I knew before the first hour that this would be the night the building made its move, outside of itself. At 9:48 p.m., the monitors in the reading room woke one by one, without hands. Squares of flat blue in the dim. The hum thickened until it had a texture, the way heat shimmers have texture. I didn't step across the threshold. From the children's corner came laughter. Too early. High and layered. The kind kids make when they've invented a secret and think the adults won't get it. Rule 5 tugged at the back of my neck. I kept to the center aisle, where the stone was broad. I logged anomalies because writing them made them smaller. Monitors active out of schedule. Children's niche, auditory. The pen left a glossy trail before the ink sank. My watch said 9:51. Above us, the bells breathed a dry preparatory cough, though they weren't due. By 10:30, the stained glass over the south transept bled the wrong color again, a gelatinous purple where red should be. The light painted a bruise across the manuscripts table. I lowered the shade halfway, the way we're supposed to for conservation, and the color crawled up the linen like oil and stayed. When I stepped back, the hair behind my ears prickled, as if someone had blown across it. The air had changed. It picked up the metallic tang that rides just ahead of a storm and something else, older. Stone wet beyond where human hands can dry it. In the triforium, a rook opened and closed its beak at the glass, silent as a menacing mime. The catalog terminal hummed, though the screen was off. Keys depressed, rose, depressed. The rhythm wasn't random. It was close to a prayer, close to my name, and close to the word open, when you say it under your breath. At 11:17 p.m., the island went dark. The exit signs glowed a dull arterial red, and then dimmed to a heartbeat. The radio produced a dense, crawling static that felt like insects. If you listened too long, the mechanical bell on the wall did not ring. The big bells above didn't either. A quiet, none of us had paid for, settled so heavy my ears thought they had been stopped. From the south gate came the soft, obscene sound of iron loosening. The space between door and frame widened a sliver. Blackness, the texture of liquid, leaned into the aisle. It gathered at my boots, climbing past the laces. Cold that burned the nerves, and then left them guessing. I stepped backward. It came with me, as if tide had decided my ankles were shoreline. On the monitors, though power was gone, the reading room populated, not with patrons, with 12 versions of the cataloger, each seated at a terminal he had never been given. 12 heads tilted at an identical angle. 12 screens washing identical blue across 12 faces whose eyes reflected nothing but machine. Thomas, the child had called me once in another life, through another mouth. Adrian, she said now, her voice carried from the nave as if it had been poured into a brass tube. The penitent child walked into the middle of the main aisle. Her white dress found red from the exit signs, and held it. Her mouth was wider than bodies allow. "We're tired of the rules," she said with no effort. A choir of other voices braided through hers. "We've been patient." Rule 4 lashed my mind. Trust the bells, not the clocks. The bells were still. I didn't trust the stillness. The ropes for the old toxin hung in the service corridor. Braided hemp, a human arm's reach from me if I chose to sprint. On the floor, the blackness from the undercroft darkened and darkened. In the children's corner, little chairs turned themselves, a click at a time, to face me. "You can't ignore us anymore," she said. "We know you now." I didn't answer. I backed toward the service corridor. My hand closed on the ring of keys. The weight of them steadied me with a simple physics. The air ate heat from my cheeks until it hurt, teeth biting skin all across my face. Behind me, somewhere in stone too old for wiring, a bell made up its mind to remember how to ring. I ran. The toxin rope was a fat, rough snake. It smelled like old rain and smoke. I seized it with both hands and pulled. The first strike came up through the bones of the building, a bass note you feel in the feet before you hear in the head. The sound went out into the nave with authority, into the walls where tiny mason marks had been cut, into the wood where carvers had left signatures and jokes. Somewhere under the varnish, lines I'd only seen as scratches woke a thin blue. They connected to other thin blues until a net began to draw itself over the room. I pulled again. The second bell answered the first, lower, and the net tightened. The exit sign red looked less like blood, and more like a fact. The blackness at my shins shivered and withdrew the width of a boot. The penitent child stopped mid-aisle, her head tilted, as if she were hearing something beyond me. The catalog screens flickered. On 3 of them, the man rose and pressed against something invisible with his palms. The glass did not crack, but the pixels did. Waves of dead squares moving out from the places his hands touched. He couldn't cross. I ran the corridor and pulled a second rope, another bell in another shaft, a note a fraction brighter than the first. The air throbbed. The old wood under the desk where HS had hidden his notebook glowed, where that mason's mark lived. A line of blue crawled up a column, across a beam. Down the edge of a case, the lines met and held. The building had been dressed in a grid it remembered from a century ago. The black at my feet retreated a yard, and then pushed back like surf after a wave breaks. It wasn't leaving, it was learning. Wax on a candle by the reading table began to climb the wick instead of falling. Reverse gravity. A long white finger reaching up to touch a ceiling it would never reach. The smell of hot wax rode the bell's notes. Far above in the tower, something that had been silent since electrics were installed shuddered. Gears notched with grease from dead men considering whether to move. I needed the next chime point, the one at the base of the grand stairs. I ran there and yanked the pull. The third bell joined the conversation, and now the whole place vibrated. Trivial dust shook out of carvings. The stone did that low moan you only hear when it's asked to remember too much. The net brightened. The black receded. The child took a step backward without meaning to. "Stop," she said. Not to me, to the building, to the bells. Her smile thinned until it was a cut. The bells alone weren't enough. I could feel it, like you feel there's one more stair in the dark when you've come to the landing. The net didn't cover everything. The undercroft kept breathing its oil into the gap. I saw where the thin blue lines faltered, behind the archives door. The old plans I had studied in the parish records mapped 5 stations in a pattern. I had rung 4. The last sat behind glass and keys and the little red dot of a motion sensor. That should have been dead, but blinked at me like an eye anyway. The darkness surged as if it understood the math. I ran. The corridor smelled of paper left in a damp trunk, of ink, of dried milk glue. My keys chattered against my belt and then bit my fingers when I took them in my hand. My breath dragged cold and fire together into my lungs. Behind me, the penitent's steps never got faster and never got slower, which was worse. The choir of her voices braided harder, like ropes. The archive door took a key with an A filed into the head. The iron worked begrudgingly. When the lock gave, the sound was intimate enough to blush. I went in. The net behind me held a second, and then juddered. The bells boomed again, impatient that I hadn't finished the job. "Adrian," the child called, almost tender. "It won't hold. We've grown beyond your rules." I smelled smoke. That wasn't there yet. The archives are an inside of an inside. Boxes quiet as tombs, flat files labeled in ink that's gone brown. A glass case in the center, holding a document no one outside a grant committee cares about. The charter that turned a dirty piece of land and a stack of stones into a place where paper could be allowed to live. I didn't look at it yet. On the wall behind the case, a red metal box with a yellowed label. Alarma, in a font that loved serifs. Dust cobwebbed the corner. I smashed the glass with my flashlight. Shards lodged in my palm without meaning to. The lever inside fought me halfway. and then yielded. Somewhere in the walls, a spring wrote a circle and let go. The fifth bell joined. It didn't sound like the others. It sounded older. Its metal poured in a time when the city smelled different, when the same carried other things. The note sang through my bones, through the air, through the library's joints. The blue lines flared until they were almost white. The grid closed. The pressure in the room changed, a drop that made my ears want to pop. The catalog men on the screens blurred and smudged into blocks. The darkness at the threshold recoiled like a salted slug. The penitent child pressed a hand to something I couldn't see, and it pushed back. "Not enough," she said between teeth that had too many cousins. Her voice is harmonized, then detuned, until it sounded like a pipe organ out of tune. "We are not only this, we've learned to grow." HS's neat hand in my head. They exist through the binding of purpose to place. The grid was old protection, but the tether wasn't the grid. The tether was the promise written and signed and witnessed, that said this place would be a library, and that promise had been sitting in a glass coffin, waiting for a day someone would need to touch fire to it. I broke the case. The glass came free like brittle sugar. The paper inside was pale and dry, proud of how long it had survived. The ink had gone brown-black, making loops in the French a boy at catechism would never have been able to read. I smelled animal skin. I smelled old smoke from candles that had stood too close to celebratory trays. I smelled dust from before I was born. "Shh, no," the penitent said, for the first time sounding like a child and not a choir. "No." I pulled the old steel lighter out of my pocket, the one I hadn't thrown away, because men don't throw away things that still work, even when they're trying to be better. The wheel rasped, the flame was small and precise. I held the corner of the charter to it. At first, the paper considered not burning. Then it sighed and went. Fire on old skin makes a sound, a tiny crackle like fingernails on silk. The edges curled, the ink blackened and opened into fish scales of ash. The smell went all the way into my sinuses until my eyes watered. The bells rang over it all, and the blue lines pulsed once, twice, like a body finding a pulse after breaking ice. The darkness poured back as if down a drain. The catalog screens went blank together, then revealed their own blackness, as if it had always been there. The penitent child's mouth stopped being wrong. For a heartbeat, she was a tidy girl again, hair braided, dress clean, then she was gone. And where she had stood, the air moved like a sigh through grass. Silence fell, in the heavy way it does after music. Emergency lights blinked on like shy animals. The monitors gave up a blue that belonged to electricity and not to ghosts. Outside, a far siren glanced off the river and went away. The exit signs glowed reasonably. The scent of burned parchment hung in the archive room and would for days. I knew that already. I scattered the ash with 2 fingers, as if that would keep the promise from knitting back together. I knew it wouldn't. Not forever. The building would grow a new tether, because that is what buildings do. But for now, the net held. My hands shook when I clicked the lighter shut. In the little silence after the metal snapped, I could hear the building breathing again. And this time, the breath belonged to stone. The clock on the wall said 5:47 a.m. The bells would speak at 6. And this time, I thought I might be willing to trust them. Dawn crawled up the nave like thin milk. It found dust and warmed it, found carvings and made them soft, found the south gate with its crooked hinges, and let the iron look ordinary again. The black streaks on the floor, where the fingers had bled, had turned to brittle smuts. When I bent to touch them, they fluttered and went to nothing. My breath plumed once in the cold that collects at the base of stone, because the air decided to be daytime. I walked the building, because I needed it to tell me itself what had changed. The children's corner sat too neat. One chair was angled a degree off the line. The kind of thing only a boring man notices. I put it back with 2 fingers, and my skin almost almost tingled. The catalog terminal was dark and honest. The keyboard had crumbs in it from a real person. The toxin rope hung straight, smelled of hemp, bell metal, and a ghost of sweat. When I reached the desk, the compartment under the lip clicked open under my hand like a trained animal. The HS notebook lay where I had left it. The edge of the leather was warm, though my fingers were cold. In the margin of the last page, in a hand that was not HS's and not mine, a line had been added. Bells remember what we forget. The ink was fresh enough to smear under my thumb. I didn't smear it. The small door on the transept opened with the modest sigh it saves for early staff. Helen came in, carrying the outside smell on her coat. Wet stone, old river, a hint of bakery from across the bridge. Her eyes took in the ash on my hands, the tilt of the south gate, the absence that had weight. "You've reset the balance," she said. No triumph. Just relief. The tired settling of a person who knows she's not done yet. The rules will work again, for now. "The charter's gone," I said. "It will reform," she said. "These places always grow their bindings back. You've bought us time." She looked at me the way a nurse looks at a patient who has walked a lap more than charted. "You have a choice, Mr. Mercer. Walk away with your hair too white in 2 places, and your dreams full of bells. Or stay. Help keep the net tight. The rules protect everyone." The room smelled like spent smoke, and lemon oil, and the wool of her coat. A rook on the roof spoke a single syllable of rook language. That sounded, in that moment, exactly like my name. I thought of Michael Arden's hand on a shoulder that hadn't been there, of Jacob Miller writing orders to himself in careful ink, of William Caron's voice coming up a stairwell that had never been poured, of Emily laughing at a cafe, unafraid because someone else had taken the fear and sat with it. I picked up the logbook. My pen felt comfortable again for the first time in weeks. The box around 6 a.m. waited like a mouth. I wrote, "All secure," in letters neat enough that HS would not have been ashamed to share a desk with me. I didn't say out loud which choice I had made. I didn't have to. Helen nodded once, acknowledgement more than approval, and turned to check the bell pull like she always did. 2 fingers, precise. The big bells above the city rolled the hour. Their sound came down the tower, over the nave, into the floor, through my shoes, into my bones. It was right. It was on time. It was ordinary. And yet, somewhere under the stone, behind the south gate, that looked tired and innocent in the morning, the Undercroft exhaled. Just once. A cool little draft that smelled of damp iron, and candle smoke, and a voice about to speak. The white at my temples ticked forward another hair's width, and the bell's last echo tucked itself into the corners, like a cat that intends to stay.